In a small village surrounded by lush green hills and sprawling farms, Princess Adanne lived a life of quiet solitude. Her father, King Chuck Mecca, was a respected ruler who governed the village with wisdom and kindness. As the king's eldest daughter, Adanne was known for her gentle heart and compassionate nature, traits that endeared her to the villagers. However, beneath her kind exterior lay a painful secret that Adanne had struggled with all her life, an overpowering body odor that clung to her, no matter what she did. Even as a young girl, Adanne's scent was stronger than that of the other children. It wasn't the typical smell of youth or play, it was a pungent, sour odor that only seemed to intensify as she grew older. By the time Adanne reached womanhood, the unpleasant smell had become a part of her, trailing behind her like an invisible cloud wherever she went. As Adanne blossomed into a young woman, the villagers' perception of her began to change. People who once greeted her with warmth and friendliness now avoided her. Whispers followed her everywhere she went. Unkind jokes and snide comments about the stinky princess echoed through the marketplace. Mothers would hurriedly pull their children away when they saw her walking down the dusty village road. The young girls who had once been her playmates now turned away, pretending not to see her as they hurried past. The isolation weighed heavily on Adanne's heart, filling her with a deep and aching sadness. Despite her beauty and royal status, suitors who came from neighboring villages and kingdoms were soon deterred by her odor. At first, they would approach her, captivated by her graceful appearance, but as soon as they got close enough, the smell would drive them away. They left just as quickly as they came, shaking their heads in dismay. It didn't matter that Adanne was the king's daughter, or that she possessed a beauty like no other. Her strong body odor overshadowed everything. The rejections left Adanne feeling more alone than ever. With each passing day, the walls of the palace became more of a prison for Adanne. She would spend her time locked away in her bedroom, staring wistfully out of her window. Her dreams were filled with fantasies of true love, a man who would look beyond her outward flaws and love her for the kind soul she was. But as the days turned into months and the months into years, it felt as if her dream was slipping further away. Many nights she would cry herself to sleep, the loneliness pressing down on her like a heavy weight. On one particularly hot, sunny day, the air in the village was filled with the sound of joyous drumming and laughter. Adanne sat in her castle bedroom, fanning herself, when the lively sounds from the village square floated up to her window. She leaned out, her eyes lighting up at the sight of people dancing around a bonfire, celebrating the annual summer feast day. For a brief moment, she felt a flicker of excitement. Maybe today, if she was careful, she could join the festivities without anyone noticing her. With a sudden burst of courage, Princess Adanne quietly slipped out of the palace and made her way to the edge of the village square. She stayed hidden in the shadows, watching wistfully as the girls her age spun around in their colorful skirts, their laughter ringing out into the night. For a few moments, no one seemed to notice her presence. But then a sudden gust of wind carried her scent through the crowd. One by one, people began to wrinkle their noses, looking around in confusion for the source of the foul smell. The joyful drumming faltered and then stopped altogether. Eyes turned toward Adanne, widening in shock before twisting into sneers of disgust. Whispers and laughter spread like wildfire, fingers pointed in her direction. The carefree joy of moments earlier vanished, replaced by the harsh reality of ridicule and shame. Adanne's heart sank, and she felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned and fled, running as fast as her legs could carry her. She didn't stop until she found herself behind a thick clump of bushes, where she collapsed, her body shaking with silent sobs. Adanne crouched there, hoping no one had followed her, wishing she could disappear. But then, over the sound of her own breathing, she heard something unexpected, the steady beat of a drum, growing louder with each step. She peeked through the leaves, her eyes widening in surprise. Walking toward her was a young man with a warm smile on his face, rhythmically playing a hand drum. He didn't hesitate or falter as he approached her, as though he was completely unaffected by the scent that had driven everyone else away. When he reached her, he stopped drumming and looked at her kindly. "Why did you stop dancing back there?" he asked. "You looked so joyful and free." Adanne blinked in disbelief. You can smell me, and yet you still came looking for me," she stammered, her voice thick with confusion. "Everyone else laughs at me. They tease me because of how I smell." The young man's expression softened. "Don't worry about them," he said gently. "I think you're a wonderful dancer. Please ignore their unkind words. Dance with happiness and freedom." For the first time in as long as she could remember, Adanne felt seen, truly seen beyond her outward appearance. The kindness in the young man's eyes melted away her self-doubt. His words wrapped around her like a comforting blanket, easing the pain of years of ridicule. The young man began playing his drum again, a cheerful, upbeat rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the air. At first, Adanne hesitated, unsure if she could really let go of her fears. But as the beat picked up, something inside her broke free. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and started to sway gently in time with the music. The stranger's smile grew wider as he watched her move, his eyes filled with admiration. He played faster, urging her on, and she responded with light, graceful steps, her movements flowing effortlessly with the rhythm. In that moment, Adanne felt a freedom she had never known. It was as if the music had unlocked something deep inside her. She danced with her whole heart, her body moving in ways that felt like an extension of her very soul. She leapt and spun, twirling with abandon, the wind lifting her hair as she laughed in pure, unbridled joy. When the music finally slowed and stopped, the two of them stood there, breathing hard but smiling at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Adanne's heart felt lighter than it had in years. The young man introduced himself as Adanne, a drummer from a nearby village who played at festivals and celebrations. He asked if she would meet him here again tomorrow to talk and dance once more. With a genuine smile, Adanne agreed. For the first time in her life, she had found someone who didn't see her as an outcast. She hurried back to the palace, her heart brimming with hope, the promise of a new friendship lighting up the darkness that had once filled her life. Adanne could feel that Adanne was truly seeing her, not just her outward appearance, but her very heart and soul. It was the first time in her life that she felt completely accepted, just as she was. This realization washed over her like a wave of relief, freeing her spirit. She let go of all her self-consciousness and began to dance fluidly, her body unfurling into graceful motions that left her breathless and exhilarated. The beat of the drum quickened and Adanne's feet moved even faster. She leaped and spun with newfound confidence, her steps weaving intricate patterns that seemed to come to her naturally. The rhythm flowed through her, filling her with a pure, uncontainable joy. Adanne's admiring gaze held hers steadily, making her feel liberated, free to express the love she had for dancing, unburdened by fear or shame. When Princess Adanne finally stopped dancing, she and Adanne shared a long, meaningful look. She felt elated, uplifted by the realization that she had been seen, not judged, but truly seen and accepted. They both burst into laughter, the sound of their shared happiness echoing softly in the quiet of the bushes. Once they had caught their breath, the young man introduced himself. "My name is Adanne," he said, smiling warmly. "I'm from a nearby village, and I play drums at events and celebrations in the squares." He hesitated, then asked with a hopeful look, "Will you meet me here again tomorrow? I'd love to play for you again and maybe see you dance some more." Adanne's heart soared. She eagerly agreed, promising to meet him in the same spot. For the first time in years, her heart felt light, as though a great burden had been lifted. The isolation and ridicule she had endured seemed to fade away in the warmth of Adanne's kindness. He had not only accepted her, but he had delighted in her presence and her dancing. She hurried back to the palace, her mind racing with anticipation for their next meeting. For the first time ever, she felt she had found a true friend, someone who saw her for who she really was. Over the following weeks, Adanne and Adanne's secret meetings became the highlight of her days. Her wild, uninhibited dancing drew them closer, enhancing their connection. When she twirled past him, Adanne's eyes would light up with admiration, not just for her beauty, but for her spirit and essence. Their initial bond blossomed into a deep, trusting friendship that quickly budded into a tender affection. It wasn't long before Princess Adanne realized she was falling in love with Adanne, and she felt his love for her growing in return. Despite the joy they shared, a part of Adanne's heart ached. She was a royal princess destined to marry for political alliances and social standing. Adanne, though talented and kind, was a struggling musician from a humble background. The social divide between them felt like an insurmountable barrier. Still, in her most private dreams, Adanne wished desperately that their love could defy tradition and bring them together. One sunny afternoon, as they sat closely together, talking and laughing, Adanne suddenly became serious. He took both of her hands in his eyes filled with deep emotion. "Adanne," he began, his voice sincere, "I care for you more than I can say. I want us to be together forever." He paused, searching her face. "Will you marry me? I don't care about royal customs or getting anyone's permission. All I know is that being with you makes me truly happy, and I want us to build a life together, bonded in love." Tears welled up in Adanne's eyes. She was overwhelmed with the joy she had never felt before. This was what she had dreamed of, someone who loved her unconditionally, someone who saw her heart. Without hesitation, she threw her arms around Adanne and whispered a tearful, "Yes." They shared a long, tender kiss, one that seemed to seal their love in a way words never could. It was a love so pure and freeing that Adanne felt as though she was floating. When they finally pulled away, their faces were flushed and glowing with happiness. The lovers made enthusiastic plans, brimming with excitement for their future together. They decided to share the wonderful news with their families immediately. They would first approach Adanne's parents, the king and queen, to ask for their blessing, then travel to Adanne's village to seek his family's approval. The pair clasped hands tightly, their hearts full of hope as they set off on this new journey together. However, fate had a cruel twist in store for them. Not long after their engagement, a terrible tragedy swept through the villages. A deadly, fast-spreading plague ravaged the countryside with merciless speed. The early symptoms were horrifying, a raging fever followed by skin covered in large, boil-like blisters. Within days, the infected would descend into violent fits of madness, only to fall deathly still. The sight of the afflicted was enough to strike terror into the hearts of even the bravest villagers. In a desperate attempt to contain the outbreak, the leaders of the neighboring villages took drastic measures. They ordered a complete lockdown, sealing off all borders. Travel was forbidden, and anyone caught trying to flee would be captured, quarantined, or even killed on sight by the fearful guards. As the plague continued its relentless spread, week after week, the villagers retreated into their homes, terrified of coming into contact with anyone who might be infected. Friends and neighbors barricaded their doors and windows, venturing outside only for essential provisions before scurrying back into their self-imposed isolation. For Adanne, the separation from Adanne was unbearable. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, with no word from her beloved. Trapped within the palace walls, she could only pray that he was safe. The hopeful joy she had felt about their future faded, replaced by a gnawing fear for his well-being. The world outside remained frozen in fear, locked in an endless cycle of isolation as the plague ran its course. Adanne and Adanne could only hold on to the hope that the other was still alive. Then one fateful morning, Adanne awoke with a fever. Red boils had begun to spread across her arms, a telltale sign that the plague had found her. The illness took hold of her quickly, with feverish sweats soaking her sheets and crushing fatigue weighing her down. The king and queen were beside themselves with worry, watching helplessly as their daughter slipped further into illness. In a desperate attempt to contain the terrifying outbreak, the leaders of the 4 neighboring villages made a drastic decision. They ordered a complete sealing off of all borders, forbidding any travel between the towns. The isolation was brutal, but the fear of contagion was greater. Villagers who attempted to flee were met with armed guards who, gripped by fear, enforced the quarantine mercilessly. Anyone caught trying to escape was immediately detained, some even killed on sight to prevent the spread of the plague. It was a time of utter chaos and despair, as week after week, the villages remained in lockdown. Homes became prisons as terrified residents barricaded themselves inside. Families huddled together, avoiding all contact with outsiders. Friends and neighbors, once close as kin, now turned away from one another. Doors and windows were boarded up tightly, only opening briefly when essential supplies had to be fetched. Even then, people hurried like shadows, their faces masked with fear, rushing back to their self-imposed isolation. For Princess Adanne, the isolation was unbearable. The joy she had felt dreaming of a future with Adanne was replaced by a gnawing dread. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Trapped within the palace walls, she had no way of knowing if her beloved Adanne was safe. The once vibrant halls of the palace now felt like a gilded cage as the plague's grip tightened around the kingdom. Adanne could do nothing but pray fervently that Adanne was still alive somewhere beyond the sealed gates, longing for her as she did for him. Then, one bleak morning, the worst of her fears was realized. Adanne awoke feeling feverish, her skin burning hot to the touch. As she pulled back the sleeves of her gown, she saw the telltale red boils spreading across her arms. The plague had found her at last. The illness struck swiftly and without mercy. Her body was racked with fever so intense that her sheets were soaked through with sweat. She lay weak and helpless, barely able to lift her head for a sip of water. The sight of their eldest daughter suffering was unbearable for King Chuck Mecca and the Queen. They watched helplessly as Adanne's once lively eyes became dull and lifeless. They tried every remedy they could think of. The royal doctor applied herbal poultices and maggot treatments meant to draw out the sickness, but nothing seemed to help. Day by day, the princess grew weaker, her face pale as death. The fear in the palace was palpable. It seemed as though Adanne's life was slipping away before their very eyes. In her darkest moment, the queen remembered a forgotten remedy from her own childhood, a bitter tonic once brewed by an old village healer when Adanne was a baby. Though the ingredients were unappealing and the mixture foul, the queen was willing to try anything. She instructed the royal doctor to prepare the potion, a concoction made of bitter roots and the blood of an old goat, left to ferment for weeks. The queen herself spooned the revolting liquid into Adanne's mouth, whispering prayers for a miracle. Amazingly, the very next day, Adanne stirred for the first time in days. Her fever, which had burned like a raging fire, began to subside. Over the next week, the princess slowly regained her strength, with the queen never leaving her side. The strange tonic, combined with the unwavering love of her mother, seemed to pull Adanne back from the brink of death. Though she was still frail, she had survived what many had not. The illness that ravaged so many had spared her, leaving her parents weeping tears of relief. As her recovery continued, Adanne finally stood up from her sick bed, her legs shaky after weeks of lying still. She walked slowly across her room, steadying herself against the wall. Every step felt like a victory. She approached the full-length mirror that stood in the corner, hesitant but curious to see her reflection. What she saw left her speechless. The fever had purged her body of more than just the illness. Her skin looked fresh, supple, and radiant in a way it never had before. Most astonishingly, as she lifted her arm to her nose, she realized with shock and delight that the chronic, unbearable odor she had carried her entire life was completely gone. It was as though the prolonged, feverish sweating had cleansed her very pores. Her skin now smelled sweet and clean. Adanne's laughter echoed through the room, filled with pure, uncontainable joy. She twirled around, inhaling the scent of her own skin, almost unable to believe it. It was a miracle she had never dared hope for. Nearly weeping with happiness, she rushed from her room, eager to share the incredible news with her parents. The infection that had nearly taken her life had instead given her an unimaginable gift, a freedom from the curse she had lived with for so long. The joy in the palace was immense. The king and queen embraced their daughter, overjoyed at her recovery and her newfound confidence. The news of her miraculous transformation spread quickly. Adanne felt like a new person, lighter and more joyful than she had ever been. Months passed, and at long last, the deadly plague began to lose its grip on the land. The quarantines were lifted, and the villagers slowly emerged from their homes, blinking in the sunlight like creatures surfacing from the depths of the earth. Adanne felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation as she walked through the main gate of the castle for the first time in over a year. She remembered the last time she had tried to join the village festivities, how people had recoiled from her, whispering insults and pulling their children away. But today was different. As she moved through the bustling market square, heads turned, but not in disgust. Villagers paused in their bartering to gaze at her, admiration clear in their eyes. Praises filled the air. "Look at her grace," one woman whispered. "She's more beautiful than ever," said a young man, his eyes wide with awe. The local youths who once avoided her now couldn't seem to take their eyes off her. Adanne felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she had never known. For the first time in her life, she felt not just accepted, but admired and adored. Her cured odor and newfound confidence had transformed her into the village belle that no one could ignore. Adanne was dizzy with the thrill of it all, basking in the compliments and affection of the villagers. It felt like a dream. In her newfound pride and joy, she almost forgot the man who had loved her before the change, who had seen her true beauty from the very beginning. But as she walked through the village, basking in her moment of triumph, she spotted a familiar figure running eagerly toward her. It was Adanne, his face alight with joy at the sight of her. Adanne's heart clenched. Her first impulse was to run into his arms, to embrace the man who had loved her when no one else did. But something stopped her. The memory of her new status and the crowd's adoring eyes held her back. Adanne's grin faltered as he approached, seeing the hesitation in her eyes. He opened his arms, expecting the warm embrace they had shared so many times before. But Adanne took a step back, her face turning cold and distant. Confusion and hurt flashed across Adanne's face as he realized she was not going to welcome him. "Adanne," he said softly, his voice laced with heartbreak. "What's happened? I thought we were going to share our future together." Adanne's gaze was steely as she replied, "You will address me as Princess Adanne. I have moved beyond what we once were. I belong to a higher world now, Adanne." The words cut like a knife. Adanne's face crumpled in sorrow, but before he could say another word, Adanne turned sharply and walked away, her head held high. Inside, her heart was breaking, but she ignored the pain. For now, she had chosen a path of pride and vanity, leaving behind the pure love she once cherished. Adanne, now confident and fully embraced by the village's newfound admiration, had become the belle that no one could ignore. The transformation brought her endless attention and the adoration she had once longed for, yet the thrill of acceptance was tinged with a hollow echo of loneliness. She basked in the praises, forgetting the one person who had loved her unconditionally, even at her lowest. Walking through the village one day, she spotted a familiar figure, bounding down the dusty road with an eager smile. It was Adanne, her beloved friend, the one who had seen her true beauty before anyone else did. His eyes sparkled with joy at the sight of her, filled with the warmth and love that had never wavered, even through the silent months of separation. Adanne's first impulse was to run into his arms, tears of relief welling up for the man who had filled her heart with love. But as he drew closer, doubts crept in like shadows. She was a royal princess now, held high by the villagers who once mocked her. She had risen far above her old life, and Adanne was still a humble drummer boy. No wealth, no noble name. She felt a surge of insecurity, as if embracing him now would undo all the status she had gained. With a heavy heart, she steeled herself, composing her face into a mask of cold distance before he reached her. When he did, Adanne's face lit up, his joy radiant. "My princess," he exclaimed, his voice cracking with emotion. "How I have missed basking in your beauty and radiance. I thought of you every day. I feared I'd lost you to the plague." He stepped forward, arms wide, expecting the warm embrace they had shared so many times before. But Adanne recoiled, her face turning away sharply. Her rejection hit him like a blow. Adanne's expression faltered, his eyes wide with confusion and hurt. He searched her face, trying to find the warmth that had always been there. "Adanne," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What's happened? Why are you pulling away?" Her gaze was icy, her tone sharp and cutting, nothing like the kind voice he had known. "You will address me as Princess Adanne," she declared. "I no longer wish to continue this relationship. I have emerged from the plague stronger, more beautiful, and I belong in a higher social realm now. A common boy like you cannot fit into my life anymore." The words sliced through Adanne's heart. He stumbled back, his face contorted with shock and disbelief. "But Adanne, I love you," he protested, his voice breaking. "These long months only made me love you more. I'd do anything to make you my wife. I thought you felt the same." Adanne's eyes narrowed and she lifted her chin, feeling a cruel satisfaction in her own words as she spoke. "This conversation ends here," she spat. "I deserve better. I deserve someone who can match my new status, not a poor drummer boy." Without another word, she turned her back on him and walked away, her head held high. The elegant folds of her gown swept behind her, hiding the tears that were already beginning to well up in her eyes. Adanne stood frozen, his hands reaching out helplessly, his heart shattered into a million pieces. In her mind, Adanne convinced herself that cutting ties so abruptly would close this chapter of her life for good. She was determined to step into her new role as the adored princess, surrounded by noble suitors vying for her attention. The following months were filled with lavish courtship from lords and princes who showered her with extravagant gifts and endless flattery. These were the very men who once turned away from her in disgust, but now sought her hand eagerly, entranced by her transformation. Adanne grinned as she soaked up their praises about her flawless skin, graceful movements, and regal presence. It felt like a dream come true. Yet, despite the wealth of attention, she could not shake the small, persistent ache gnawing at her heart, a gnawing regret that whispered of the love she had thrown away. As weeks passed, King Chuck Mecca began pressing Adanne to choose a husband. The whispers of court gossip were growing, and he feared they might harm her reputation if she delayed any longer. Eager to showcase her beauty and maintain her dominance over the attention of the court, Adanne announced she would host a grand wrestling tournament. The kingdom's strongest men would compete for the chance to marry her. The announcement sent a buzz of excitement through the land, drawing men of great strength from far and wide, all hoping to win the favor of the renowned princess. In the days leading up to the event, Adanne became consumed with enhancing her appearance. Her maids worked tirelessly, grooming her to perfection. Yet, in her obsession with outer beauty, she neglected the simple practice of regular baths, letting vanity overshadow common sense. Slowly, the odor she thought she had left behind began creeping back. On the morning of the tournament, the weather was perfect. The arena was filled with cheering crowds, eager to see the kingdom's finest warriors. Adanne entered the arena, her gown shimmering with silks and jewels, her every step calculated to dazzle the audience. She lifted her delicate hand to wave at the crowd, but instead of the expected cheers, she heard a collective gasp. A murmur spread like wildfire. The crowd began to wrinkle their noses, recoiling from the strong, familiar stench that emanated from the princess. Whispers turned to hushed laughter, and the men who had come to fight for her favor exchanged uneasy glances. One by one, they began to withdraw, shaking their heads in embarrassment. Adanne's smile faltered as she realized what was happening. The villagers, who had once praised her beauty, now turned away, talking quietly amongst themselves. Her heart sank, a wave of humiliation crashing over her. She felt the old shame return, the same shame she had felt as a young girl, mocked by the villagers for something she could not control. Desperate and distraught, Adanne stripped off her fancy clothes and jewelry, tossing them to the ground as if they were the source of her humiliation. With tears streaming down her face, she fled the arena, running blindly until she reached the edge of the grounds. There, standing alone, was Adanne. He watched her approach, his face etched with both sadness and compassion. He stepped forward, meeting her tear-filled eyes. "My dear, precious one," he said softly, his voice a balm to her shattered heart. "How could you think so little of our love? Why would you trade it for the fleeting approval of those who never saw you as I did?" Adanne collapsed into his arms, the sobs racking her body. "Please forgive me, Adanne," she whispered through her tears. "I was so foolish, thinking that beauty and admiration were more important than our love. I was vain and careless, and now I've lost the only thing that truly mattered, your love and care." Adanne held her tightly, his own eyes brimming with tears. "You never lost my love," he murmured. "It has always been yours. You are more beautiful to me now, in your humility and honesty than ever before." Adanne looked up at him, her heart filled with a mix of sorrow and relief. For the first time, she truly understood the depth of his love, a love that had never been swayed by her appearance or status. It was a love that saw her entirely, flaws and all. In that moment, the proud, vain princess was gone. Adanne, humbled and sincere, knew where her heart truly belonged. She took Adanne's hand, and together they walked away from the crowd, leaving behind the empty pursuit of admiration, stepping instead into the warmth of a love that would never fade.